Snow fell heavily across Paterson that morning, but just like every other weekday, Nala was already waiting when the first bus pulled up to the curb. "Morning, Nala," Harris greeted her with a smile as she climbed aboard. "Morning, Harris." She took her usual seat by the window while the bus rolled through the quiet streets. At the next red light, Harris glanced into the rearview mirror and noticed her pale face. She looked more exhausted than he had ever seen her. He walked over and held out his breakfast. "Here. You look like you could use this more than I do." Nala smiled politely before accepting it. "Thank you." Harris looked at her for another moment. "You really don't look well today. Why not stay home and get some rest?" Nala shook her head. "I can't," Harris nodded slowly. "After all these years, I guess I've earned the right to ask." Nala smiled faintly. "Ask what?" "I've watched you catch my first bus almost every morning for 6 years. Rain, snow, it never seems to matter. What keeps bringing you here before the sun is even up?" Nala looked out at the falling snow beyond the window. "Because I want to give my son a better future. Every day I stop pushing forward, that future moves a little farther away." Harris looked at her quietly for a moment, then gave a small nod and returned to the driver's seat. The rest of the journey passed in silence. At exactly 3 o'clock every morning, Nala reached over and silenced her alarm before it had the chance to ring twice. The apartment remained perfectly still. She turned toward the other side of the bed where 7-year-old Anton was sleeping beneath a thick blanket. One small foot had slipped out during the night. She pulled the blanket back over him, brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead, and quietly climbed out of bed. Years of following the same routine had taught her which floorboard would creak, which cabinet door needed to be closed gently, and how to move through the apartment without waking her son. Outside, Paterson was still dark. Snow covered the sidewalks, and only a few streetlights reflected across the empty parking lot below. Most families wouldn't be awake for another few hours. Nala tied her hair back, slipped on a cardigan, and walked into the kitchen. Before lighting the stove, she glanced once toward the bedroom. Anton was still asleep. Satisfied, she placed a small pot on the burner and began another workday long before sunrise. Breakfast was always simple, but Nala tried to make it feel the same every morning so Anton would never think anything was missing. She cooked oatmeal while scrambling eggs in a small pan, then packed a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water into his lunch bag. Before zipping it closed, she opened his backpack and checked everything one last time. His math workbook was inside. His reading folder was there. The permission slip his teacher had sent home the day before had already been signed and slipped into the front pocket where he wouldn't forget it. Satisfied, she reached for her wallet and counted the cash inside without taking it out. Rent was due in 4 days, so she already knew exactly where every dollar would go. She separated the bus fare from the grocery money, then placed a few folded bills into an envelope for Anton's school lunch. When the coffee finished brewing, she opened the refrigerator for the milk. Only a little remained at the bottom of the carton. She poured all of it into Anton's bowl, stirred the oatmeal, then filled her own mug with black coffee instead. As she carried breakfast to the table, she looked around the apartment one more time. The dishes from last night had already been washed. Anton's winter boots waited beside the front door. His coat hung neatly on the wall. The apartment was small. The furniture had seen better days, but everything was clean, organized, and ready for another morning. Before Anton even opened his eyes, Nala wanted him to wake up, knowing that home was the one place in the world where everything would always be waiting for him. The smell of breakfast reached the bedroom before Nala did. A few moments later, Anton walked into the kitchen, rubbing one eye while carrying the stuffed dinosaur he had slept with for years. His hair pointed in every direction, making Nala smile before either of them said a word. "Morning, Mom. Morning, buddy. Did you sleep well?" Anton climbed onto his chair and nodded. "I had a dream that our math teacher gave us homework during Christmas break." Nala laughed as she placed the bowl of oatmeal in front of him. "That does sound like a terrible dream." Anton grinned and picked up his spoon. While he ate, Nala zipped his lunch bag and placed it beside his backpack. Halfway through breakfast, Anton reached for his glass and accidentally knocked it over. Water spread across the table and dripped onto the floor. Before Nala could grab a towel, Anton was already on his feet. "I got it!" He wiped the table first, then crouched to dry the floor before carrying the empty glass to the sink. Nala watched him quietly. "You're getting faster every week." Anton smiled proudly. "Wilson says cleaning up your own mess is part of growing up." Wilson sounds pretty smart. After finishing breakfast, Anton carried his bowl to the sink, rinsed it, then put on his winter coat without being reminded. Nala helped zip it up the rest of the way and adjusted the scarf around his neck. "Math test today," she said. Anton nodded confidently. "I'll do my best. That's all I ask." He slipped one arm through his backpack, reached for the lunch bag, and started toward the door. Just before stepping into the hallway, he turned around. "Don't forget to eat lunch today, okay?" Nala smiled. "I'll try," Anton pointed at her with a playful grin. "Not try. Promise." She raised one hand. "I promise." Satisfied, Anton waved goodbye and headed toward school with the children from the neighboring apartments who met him downstairs every weekday morning. The apartment became quiet again. Nala looked around one last time to make sure nothing had been forgotten. She picked up her coat, slipped her bus pass into one pocket, and locked the door behind her. The cold morning air immediately filled her lungs as she stepped outside. Snow covered the sidewalks, leaving only a narrow path where people had walked earlier in the night. She pulled her scarf a little higher and started toward the bus stop at the same steady pace she followed every morning. There was no need to hurry. She always left home early enough to arrive several minutes before the first bus. Over the years, that habit had become as important as waking up at 3 o'clock. Missing the first bus meant arriving late at the staffing agency, and arriving late could mean losing the best assignment of the day. She had learned that lesson once. She never intended to learn it again. As she walked through the quiet streets of Paterson, a neighborhood bakery switched on its lights. The smell of fresh bread drifted onto the sidewalk. Nala glanced toward the display window for only a second before continuing on her way. Anton had been asking to try one of the cinnamon rolls for weeks. She smiled to herself and kept walking. Payday was still a few days away. The cinnamon rolls could wait. Right now, there was only one place she needed to be before sunrise. The familiar headlights appeared at the end of the street, just as Nala reached the bus stop. A few seconds later, the city bus pulled up to the curb, and the front doors folded open with a quiet hiss. She stepped aboard, tapped her transit card, and smiled at the man behind the wheel. "Good morning, Harris." The driver looked up and returned the smile immediately. "Morning, Nala." Looks like winter finally decided to stick around. Nala brushed a few snowflakes from her sleeve. "I was hoping the forecast was wrong. So was I. My driveway's going to need another round of shoveling tonight," she laughed. "I'm glad that's not my driveway," Harris chuckled as she walked farther down the aisle. "Have a good ride." "You too." Nala settled into the same window seat she chose every morning. It wasn't reserved, but after 6 years, everyone who rode that route regularly seemed to know it was hers. As the bus continued through Paterson, more passengers climbed aboard. 2 nurses ending the night shift greeted Harris by name before taking seats near the front. A construction worker carrying a metal lunchbox nodded politely as he walked past Nala. The conversations were brief, the faces familiar, and the route almost never changed. For the people on that bus, another workday had simply begun. A few miles later, the bus stopped at a long red light near downtown. Harris glanced into the rearview mirror as he often did during quiet moments. Nala was usually looking out the window or reading something on her phone, but this morning she simply sat there with both hands wrapped around each other. Even from the front of the bus, he could see the tiredness on her face. When the light stayed red, he reached for the lunch bag beside his seat, took out a wrapped sandwich and a bottle of orange juice, then walked toward her. "Morning meals always taste better when somebody helps you finish them," he said with a friendly smile as he held out the paper bag. Nala looked surprised. "Harris, I can't take your breakfast." "Sure you can." Linda packed enough food to feed a football team again. "If I bring half of it home, she'll spend all evening telling me I don't eat enough." Nala laughed softly for the first time that morning. "She sounds like a good wife. The best. Which is exactly why I need your help." After another second, she accepted the bag. "Thank you. Please tell Linda I said thanks too." "I'll make sure she hears it." Harris rested one hand on the top of the seat in front of her. "Can I ask you something?" Nala nodded. "Of course. I've been driving this route for a long time, and I think you've been riding my first bus almost every weekday for, 6 years now?" She smiled. "That sounds about right." Harris nodded slowly. "I've wanted to ask you this for years. I just never knew if it was any of my business." He waited until she looked back at him before finishing his thought. What makes someone wake up early enough to catch the first bus every single morning and keep doing it for 6 straight years? Nala lowered her eyes to the paper bag resting on her lap. The sandwich was still warm. She slowly ran her fingers across the folded top before looking back at Harris with a small smile. "That's a bigger question than you probably expected," Harris laughed. "I've had 6 years to think about it. I figured it was worth asking." Nala looked through the window again as the traffic light turned green and the bus eased back into motion. Buildings, traffic lights, and snow-covered sidewalks drifted past one after another, but her thoughts were somewhere else entirely. "People usually ask me where I work," she said after a moment. "Or why I always look so tired," she smiled faintly. "You're the first person who's asked why I take this bus." Harris didn't rush her. He simply nodded and returned to his seat, giving her the time to answer whenever she was ready. Nala held the bottle of orange juice in both hands, watching the winter morning disappear beyond the fogged glass. The answer wasn't something she could explain in a single sentence. It had started years earlier, long before she knew Harris, long before La Vella Hotel became part of her life, and long before catching the first bus became as natural as breathing. 6 years earlier, Nala had believed waking up before sunrise was something only nurses, firefighters, and bakers had to do. At 25 years old, she never imagined it would become part of her own life. Back then, Anton had just celebrated his first birthday. Every decision she made revolved around finding enough money to pay the next bill while making sure her little boy never felt the weight she carried every day. When a neighbor mentioned a staffing agency that hired temporary workers across northern New Jersey, Nala treated it as another chance to get back on her feet. She spent the evening preparing everything she would need for the next morning. She ironed the only blouse that still looked presentable, packed Anton's diaper bag, wrote the agency's address on a small piece of paper, and placed it beside her apartment keys so she wouldn't forget it before leaving. She believed showing up early would make a good first impression. She had no idea that, before anyone cared about first impressions, she first had to earn a place in line. The following morning, Nala left the apartment believing she had planned everything carefully. She dropped Anton off with Jenkins, the elderly neighbor who agreed to watch him whenever she needed to look for work, then hurried toward the staffing agency with a folder tucked under one arm. She even arrived 15 minutes before the office opened. For a brief moment, she felt relieved. That feeling disappeared as soon as she turned the corner. A line of workers already stretched far down the sidewalk. Some leaned against the wall drinking coffee. Others sat on folding chairs they had brought from home. Several people greeted each other by name, clearly used to coming here every morning. Nala quietly joined the end of the line without asking any questions. When the doors opened, the dispatcher began calling out assignments: hotels, warehouses, distribution centers, construction cleanup. Workers stepped forward, accepted their assignments, and left almost immediately. The line grew shorter. So did the list in the dispatcher's hand. When Nala finally reached the front, the dispatcher looked down at the clipboard, flipped one last page, then looked back up with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry. We just filled the last opening." Nala hesitated for a second. "Is there anything else today?" He shook his head. "Not today. Come back tomorrow and try getting here earlier." She thanked him anyway, gathered her paperwork, and walked back outside. She had left home early. It still hadn't been early enough. Nala sat alone at the bus stop across the street, watching shuttle vans pull away one after another with workers who had arrived before she did. She opened her wallet and counted what remained after paying bus fare. It wasn't enough to waste on disappointment. On the ride home, she replayed the dispatcher's words again and again. Try getting here earlier. That evening, after Anton fell asleep, she prepared everything before going to bed. She laid out her clothes, packed Anton's diaper bag, filled his water bottle, placed her bus pass beside her keys, and set the coffee maker so it would be ready before dawn. Then she picked up her alarm clock. For a moment, she looked at the numbers. Yesterday, it had been set for 4 o'clock. She turned the dial back 1 full hour until it read 3. Before switching off the bedroom light, she glanced at Anton sleeping peacefully beside her. "We'll figure this out," she whispered. "I promise." The apartment became quiet again, but from that night on, 3 o'clock would become the beginning of every single day in her life. At 3 o'clock the next morning, Nala's alarm rang only once before she reached over and turned it off. She moved quickly through the apartment, preparing breakfast, getting Anton ready, and dropping him off at Jenkins' apartment while the hallway was still silent. By the time she reached the bus stop, the first bus of the day was just pulling in. She climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, and watched the empty streets pass by beneath the glow of streetlights. When the bus stopped near the staffing agency, there wasn't another worker in sight. Nala checked the address on the piece of paper in her pocket, wondering if she had come to the wrong place. 5 minutes later, another man arrived carrying a thermos, then a woman with a folding chair. Within half an hour, the sidewalk that had been empty slowly filled with people. When the doors finally opened, Nala was the first person in line. The dispatcher looked at the workers waiting outside, then began reading assignments from his clipboard. The very first name he called was hers. Nala Miller. She stepped forward immediately. Lavella Hotel. Housekeeping. Nala had never cleaned a hotel room in her life, but she accepted the assignment without hesitation. She thanked the dispatcher, collected the paperwork, and followed several other workers toward a shuttle waiting outside. The shuttle stopped behind a large hotel less than 30 minutes later. Nala stepped outside and looked up at the building. She had never entered a place like Lavella before. Guests rolled expensive suitcases through the front entrance while valets greeted them with warm smiles. Temporary workers like Nala entered through a separate employee entrance behind the building. Inside the housekeeping office, a woman in her early 40s stood waiting with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. "Good morning. I'm Monique, the housekeeping supervisor." She handed each new worker a uniform, a name tag, and a housekeeping cart assignment before explaining how the department operated. There was no long speech and no attempt to impress anyone. She simply explained the standard every room had to meet before a guest opened the door. Before dismissing the group, she looked around the room one last time. "I don't expect perfection from someone on their first day," she said calmly. "I do expect effort. If you don't know something, ask. If you make a mistake, fix it. If you think cutting corners will save time, this isn't the place for you." Nala listened carefully to every word. She hadn't come to Lavella looking for an easy job. She had come looking for a chance to keep working tomorrow. Monique pushed a housekeeping cart into the hallway and walked the new attendants through the routine expected in every room. Fresh linens, clean surfaces, restocked amenities. One final inspection before the room was released to the next guest. The steps sounded simple until Nala tried doing them herself. Her first room took nearly twice as long as the time listed on the schedule. More than once, she paused to check the instruction card attached to her cart, making sure she hadn't skipped anything. When Monique arrived for the inspection, she ran a finger along the top edge of the headboard. A thin line of dust remained. She pointed toward the bed. "Strip it," Nala blinked. "The whole bed?" "Yes," Monique met her eyes. "If a guest notices dust here, they'll start wondering what else wasn't cleaned." Nala nodded without arguing. She removed every sheet, cleaned the headboard again, and remade the bed from the beginning. Nearly 20 minutes later, Monique returned. This time, she inspected the room from the doorway to the bathroom without saying a word. Before leaving, she gave a quiet nod. The room had finally reached Lavella's standard. By the time Nala returned home that evening, every muscle in her body ached. Anton was already asleep after spending the day with Jenkins. Nala quietly covered him with a blanket before changing into comfortable clothes and sitting at the kitchen table with a small notebook she had bought for less than $1. She wrote down every correction Monique had made that day, then drew a simple floor plan of a hotel room from memory, marking the places she had almost forgotten to clean. After that, she carried a bath towel into the bedroom and began practicing the folds Monique had demonstrated that morning. The first attempt was uneven. She unfolded it and started again. The second looked better until one corner slipped out of place. She tried again, then again. After several attempts, she finally placed the towel on the bed beside the instruction card she had brought home and compared the two. It still wasn't quite right. Instead of giving up, she unfolded it one more time. By the time the towel finally matched the picture closely enough to satisfy her, nearly half an hour had passed. She smiled quietly, laid the towel aside, and stripped the bed. Once again, she practiced making it as neatly as she could while timing herself with the microwave clock. The second attempt was faster. The third was smoother. Small improvements, but real ones. When she finally looked at the time, it was almost 10 o'clock. She washed the towel she had been practicing with, returned everything to its place, set her alarm for 3 o'clock, and went to bed knowing tomorrow would give her another chance to do a little better than she had today. The first assignment at Lavella led to another, then another after that. Whenever the staffing agency needed housekeepers, Nala made sure she was already standing at the front of the line before the doors opened. Weeks turned into months, and months slowly became years. She learned how to finish each room faster without skipping a single step. She stopped looking at the instruction card attached to her cart because every detail had become second nature. Even on mornings when snow covered the roads or heavy rain slowed traffic across Paterson, she still left home early enough to catch the first bus. There were days when the agency sent her to warehouses or office buildings instead of Lavella, but she never complained. Work was work. Every assignment helped pay the rent, buy groceries, and keep Anton in school. Whenever Lavella requested extra housekeeping staff, however, her name appeared on the list more and more often. She didn't know Monique had started asking for her specifically. She simply believed she had been lucky. One morning, several years after her first day at Lavella, Monique handed out room assignments before the shift began. Most temporary workers received standard guest rooms on the lower floors. When she reached Nala's name, she paused for a moment before handing over another worksheet. Executive floor. A few workers nearby glanced in Nala's direction. Everyone in the department knew those rooms were usually assigned to the most reliable attendants. The guests paid more, expected more, and noticed details other people overlooked. Nala looked at the room numbers, then back at Monique. "Anything special I should know?" Monique shook her head. "Just do what you always do." Nala nodded, placed the assignment on top of her cart, and headed toward the service elevator. She didn't realize that simple assignment marked the first time someone at Lavella had trusted her with the hotel's most important rooms. By the time Nala had become one of the most dependable housekeepers at Lavella, Anton was 7 years old. Waking up before sunrise had become as normal to him as brushing his teeth before bed. Every weekday morning, he heard the apartment door close long before dawn, rolled over for a few more minutes of sleep, then woke up to the breakfast his mother had already prepared. He ate, got dressed, checked his backpack against the list, taped to the refrigerator, and walked downstairs to meet 3 other children from the building who took the same route to school. Nala had taught him every step of that routine over the years, not because she wanted him to grow up quickly, but because she didn't have another choice. Her workday always started before his school day did. As difficult as that had been in the beginning, Anton had slowly turned those lessons into habits. He no longer needed reminders to make his bed, put his bowl in the sink, or lock the apartment door before leaving. By the time Nala boarded the first bus each morning, she already knew exactly how the next 2 hours of her son's day would unfold. Anton was still like any other second grader in many ways. He laughed too hard at silly jokes, raced his friends across the playground, and spent far too much time talking about dinosaurs whenever someone was willing to listen. What made him different appeared in the little moments most people never noticed. If he finished the last yogurt in the refrigerator, he left the empty container on the kitchen counter instead of throwing it away because he knew his mother checked it before going grocery shopping. If he saw a piece of trash on the apartment floor, he picked it up without being asked. One afternoon after school, he found a dollar bill lying near the entrance to the building. His friend Marcus smiled and said, "Lucky you. Let's buy candy." Anton picked up the dollar, looked around for a moment, then carried it to the apartment manager's office. "Someone might come back looking for it," he explained. The manager smiled and thanked him before placing the bill in the lost and found drawer. Marcus looked at Anton as they walked away. "It was only $1. Anton shrugged. "Maybe to us. It could be lunch money to somebody else." He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply spoke the way he had learned to think after watching his mother value every single dollar that came into their home. One Friday afternoon, Nala arrived home a little earlier than usual. Anton was still playing downstairs with a few children from the building, giving her enough time to prepare dinner before he came back. As she unpacked his backpack, a folded sheet of construction paper slipped out between his homework folder and a library book. She opened it, expecting another class assignment. Instead, she found a drawing made with colored pencils. In the center was a city bus driving beneath a dark sky filled with stars. A woman stood beside the open door carrying a lunch bag, while a little boy waved from the window of a nearby apartment. Across the top of the page, written in careful second-grade handwriting, were a few simple words. "My mom goes to work before the sun comes up." At the bottom, his teacher had written another note in red ink. Anton said his mom is the hardest working person he knows. Nala read those 2 sentences several times before carefully folding the paper again. She didn't place it back inside the backpack. Instead, she slipped it into her wallet behind the family photo she carried every day. Years later, whenever life felt especially difficult, that drawing would still be there. Saturday mornings were different. Nala didn't always have to leave before sunrise, and whenever she wasn't assigned a shift, she tried to spend every possible minute with Anton. They walked to the public library, stopped by the park, or simply wandered through the neighborhood together. On one of those mornings, they passed the same bakery Nala walked by before dawn every weekday. Fresh cinnamon rolls filled the front display window, and the sweet smell drifted onto the sidewalk as customers came and went. Anton slowed down without saying a word. He looked through the glass for a few seconds before smiling at his mother. "Those look really good," Nala smiled back. "They do." Anton slipped his hands into his coat pockets and started walking again. "Maybe next time." He didn't ask how much they cost. He didn't ask if they could buy one to share. He simply kept walking beside his mother, talking about the science project his class would start the following week. Nala glanced back at the bakery for just a moment before catching up to him. She didn't answer because she had already made a promise to herself. One day, maybe next time, would become, "Let's go in." Whenever Lavella needed someone to stay after the regular shift, Monique usually looked toward Nala first. "Can you cover 2 more rooms?" Nala almost never said no. The extra pay wasn't much, but over the course of a month, it could cover Anton's winter gloves, a school field trip, or part of the electric bill. On overtime days, she called Jenkins during her break to ask if Anton could stay a little longer after school. "Don't worry about him," the older woman always replied. "We'll be fine." By the time Nala finally walked through her apartment door, the sky was already dark. Anton would be sitting at the dining table, finishing his homework or reading a library book while dinner waited on the stove exactly the way she had prepared it before leaving that morning. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, buddy. Were you good for Jenkins?" Anton smiled. "She says I talked too much." Nala laughed as she hung up her coat. "That sounds about right. She also made me eat an extra cookie." "Now that's definitely too much," Anton grinned. "I know. I sacrificed for the sake of being polite." Dinner was never anything fancy. Sometimes it was chicken soup, sometimes pasta. Other nights it was leftovers warmed up from the day before. Neither of them complained because eating together mattered more than what was on the table. Anton told his mother about school, the jokes his friends made, and the books he wanted to borrow from the library next week. Nala listened while clearing plates between bites, occasionally asking questions or laughing at one of his stories. Before going to bed, Anton took out the drawing his teacher had returned after hanging it in the classroom for a week. "Can you keep this safe?" he asked. "I don't want it to get wrinkled." Nala unfolded it once more and smiled at the picture of the little bus beneath the stars. "I'll take good care of it." She slipped it back into her wallet, right behind the family photo, then looked at Anton. "Ready for bed?" He nodded, hugged her goodnight, and disappeared into the bedroom. A few minutes later, after the apartment had become quiet again, Nala opened her wallet one more time. On one side was the small amount of cash that still had to last until payday. On the other was Anton's drawing. She closed the wallet, set her alarm for 3 o'clock, and placed it beside the bed. In a few hours, another morning would begin exactly the same way as the one before it. The following Wednesday, Nala woke up with a slight headache after several consecutive overtime shifts. She still prepared breakfast, packed Anton's lunch, and helped him button his winter coat before leaving for work. The morning passed so quickly that she forgot the lunch bag she had packed for herself on the kitchen counter. Nearly an hour later, Anton noticed it while getting ready to leave for school. He picked it up, hurried downstairs, and caught Jenkins just before she closed her apartment door. "Can you do me a favor?" he asked, holding up the lunch bag. "Mom forgot this," Jenkins smiled. "I'll drop it off at the hotel after I take my granddaughter to school." That afternoon, when Nala saw Jenkins standing in the employee entrance holding the familiar paper bag, she looked genuinely surprised. "Anton noticed you left it behind," Jenkins said. "He told me to make sure you actually ate today because you promised him." Nala couldn't help smiling. "That sounds exactly like him," Jenkins laughed. "He's been looking after you for years. I don't think you've noticed." The next morning unfolded the way countless mornings had before it. Nala left home while most of Paterson was still asleep and reached the bus stop just as the first bus pulled in. "Morning, Nala," Harris said with the familiar smile he greeted her with every weekday. "Morning, Harris." She settled into her usual window seat as the bus rolled through the quiet streets. Outside, the first hint of daylight began to appear beyond the rooftops. Inside, the ride felt no different from any other morning. Nala spent the trip reviewing the day's schedule in her mind, unaware that this ordinary workday would become one of the most important days of her life. By the time the bus reached Lavella, preparations for a major group of VIP guests were already underway. And before the day was over, someone far above her position would notice what everyone else had slowly taken for granted. By the time Nala arrived at Lavella that morning, she could tell the hotel wasn't operating like it usually did. Engineers were checking elevators before guests arrived. Fresh flower arrangements were being delivered through the service entrance. Managers from different departments walked quickly through the hallways, reviewing schedules and speaking into their radios. Even the housekeeping office felt different. Additional carts had been prepared before sunrise, and every room assignment had already been printed before the team gathered. A few minutes later, Monique stepped to the front with a clipboard in her hands. "Listen up, everyone." The room became quiet. Starting tomorrow, Lavella will be hosting a delegation from one of our biggest corporate partners. They'll be staying here for several days, and most of them will be checking into the executive floor. She looked around the room before continuing. They've stayed at hotels all over the world. That means they'll notice things most guests don't. I don't need anyone working faster this week. I need everyone working better. Nobody asked questions. Everyone understood what that meant. Monique began handing out room assignments one by one. Standard rooms, double rooms, family suites. The usual routine continued until only one sheet of paper remained on her clipboard. She looked toward Nala. "You're with me for a minute." The other attendants collected their carts and headed toward the service elevators while Nala walked over. Monique handed her the remaining assignment sheet. Nala glanced down and immediately recognized the room numbers. Every one of them was on the executive floor. She looked back up. "All of them?" Monique nodded. "Every room on this list." Nala hesitated for only a moment. "Is someone out sick?" "No." Monique closed the clipboard. "I'm assigning them to you." Nala looked at the room numbers once more. "I'll make sure they're ready." Monique met her eyes. "I know you will. That's why you're getting them." She started to walk away, then stopped. "One more thing," Nala waited. "Don't clean the room just to pass inspection." Monique tapped the assignment sheet lightly with one finger. "Clean it for the person who's about to spend $1,000 to sleep there. If you can make them feel they spent their money well, the inspection will take care of itself." Nala folded the assignment sheet, placed it on top of her cart, and headed toward the elevator without another word. The work waiting upstairs looked no different from any other day. She had no idea that before noon, someone would walk into one of those rooms and see far more than a freshly made bed. Nala parked her housekeeping cart outside the first executive suite and unlocked the door. She didn't begin working right away. Instead, she stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and stood quietly near the entrance for a few seconds. This was the same view every guest would see the moment they arrived, so she always started there. The curtains were still drawn, leaving the room darker than it needed to be. She opened them just enough to let natural light fill the suite without making it feel exposed, then began her work. Fresh sheets replaced the old ones. Every pillowcase was changed. She dusted the wardrobe, cleaned beneath the bed, wiped the inside of every drawer, and polished the bathroom fixtures until they reflected the light without streaks. While straightening the sitting area, she noticed the armchair faced directly toward the television. She paused for a moment before turning it slightly toward the window instead. The skyline outside was one of the hotel's best features. If a guest wanted to enjoy a cup of coffee before heading to a meeting, that view deserved to be the first thing they saw. At the writing desk, she adjusted the chair so it slid in smoothly beneath the tabletop instead of catching on the carpet. She placed the notepad and pen within easy reach, then checked that every outlet beside the desk was accessible without moving furniture. Before leaving, she walked back to the doorway and viewed the room one last time as though she had never been there before. Nothing felt out of place. More importantly, nothing demanded a guest's attention for the wrong reason. Only then did she close the door and move on to the next suite. Late that morning, Colin arrived at Lavella through the employee entrance instead of the main lobby. Although he owned the hotel, he rarely announced his visits in advance. He believed the easiest way to understand how a business truly operated was to see it on an ordinary workday. The general manager, department heads, and several supervisors joined him as he made his way toward the executive floor. "Our guests begin arriving after lunch," the general manager explained while handing him a room list. "Every suite has already passed housekeeping inspection." Colin nodded without saying anything. He opened the first room, walked through it slowly, and checked several details himself. He looked behind the bathroom door, opened the closet, ran a finger across the top edge of a picture frame, and studied the corners of the carpet before marking something on the list. The group continued from room to room. Some suites earned a quick check mark. Others received a brief note for minor adjustments. When Colin entered the next room on the list, he stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't say anything for several seconds. Instead, he slowly looked around the suite, noticing details that weren't written in any housekeeping manual. The room felt balanced. The lighting was comfortable. The furniture invited someone to sit down instead of simply filling empty space. Even the welcome booklet had been placed where a guest would naturally reach for it. Colin walked through the suite without finding a single detail he wanted changed. He placed a check mark beside the room number, closed the folder in his hand, and looked at the general manager. "Who cleaned this room?" The general manager looked down at the inspection sheet before turning toward Monique. "Do you know who was assigned to this room?" Monique took the clipboard, checked the room number, and answered without hesitation. "Nala Miller." Colin repeated the name quietly, committing it to memory. "Is she still on this floor?" Monique nodded. "She should be finishing the last suite at the end of the hallway." Colin closed the folder and handed it back to the general manager. "Let's go say hello." The group walked past several open service closets until they reached the final executive suite. The housekeeping cart stood outside the door, and the sound of a vacuum cleaner could be heard from inside. Monique knocked lightly on the open door before stepping aside. Nala switched off the vacuum cleaner as Monique knocked lightly on the open door. She turned around and noticed several people standing behind her. "Good morning," Monique said. "Nala, this is Colin." Nala smiled politely. "Good morning, sir. Good morning," Colin replied before taking a slow look around the suite. "I just inspected another room you prepared. I hope everything met the standard." It did. He walked toward the sitting area and rested one hand on the armchair facing the window. "This chair normally faces the television." "Yes, sir. You turned it." "I did. Why?" Nala glanced toward the skyline outside the glass. "Most guests staying on this floor spend the day in meetings. By the time they return, they've already spent hours looking at conference rooms and computer screens. If they sit down for a few minutes before dinner, I'd rather the first thing they see is the city." Colin nodded slightly without interrupting. He stepped into the bathroom and rested his hand on the marble vanity. "The faucet shines like it's brand new," Nala smiled. "It should." Colin looked back at her. "Most guests won't notice that." "They won't notice the faucet itself," Nala replied. "They'll notice the room feels well cared for. When people find fingerprints, water spots, or dust, they stop relaxing. They start wondering what else was missed. If they don't have to think about those things, they stop paying attention to the room and start enjoying their stay." Colin walked over to the writing desk. "You also moved the notepad and pen." "Yes, sir." "Another reason?" "Today's reservation says the guest is traveling for business. Most people reach for a pen within a few minutes of entering the room. I'd rather they find it exactly where they expect it to be." Colin remained silent for a moment before asking one final question. "Has anyone ever taught you to think this way?" Nala shook her head. "No, sir." "Then where did you learn it?" She looked around the suite for a brief moment before answering. "When I was little, my mother cleaned motel rooms. She always told me people don't spend money hoping to find a clean room. They spend money hoping nothing inside the room distracts them from enjoying their trip. If we do our job well, they stop noticing the room and start remembering the experience." The suite fell quiet. Colin looked around once more, but this time he wasn't inspecting the room. He was looking at the woman who understood something many people spend an entire career trying to learn. The room fell quiet for a moment. Colin slowly looked around the suite once more, this time seeing it through Nala's explanation instead of through an inspection checklist. Finally, he turned toward Monique. "How long has she been with us?" Before Monique could answer, Nala spoke first. "I'm not actually with Lavella, sir. I still work through the staffing agency." Colin looked back at her, surprised. "You're still temporary?" "Yes, sir." Monique stepped in. "She's been coming here for about 6 years. Whenever we need extra housekeepers, I ask the agency to send her if she's available." Colin frowned slightly. 6 years? Monique nodded. "I've offered to recommend her before, but we haven't had a full-time opening in housekeeping." Colin didn't say anything else. He looked at Nala one last time, thanked her for her work, and walked out of the room with the management team. As they continued down the hallway, he remained unusually quiet. The conversation kept returning to his mind, and before long, it reminded him of someone he hadn't thought about in years, his mother. Colin remained quiet for the rest of the inspection. The department heads continued discussing occupancy rates, guest arrivals, and schedules for the week, but he barely joined the conversation. His mind stayed with the housekeeper who had rearranged a chair because she imagined a tired guest might want to look out the window instead of another television. That wasn't something a checklist could teach. It came from someone who genuinely thought about the person walking into the room. As he stepped into the elevator, another memory surfaced without warning. He was 9 years old again, sitting on the floor of a small motel room while his mother changed bedsheets before the next guest arrived. His father worked construction and often left before sunrise, so whenever school was closed, Colin spent the day following his mother from room to room. She never rushed, even when the manager complained about time. "People save money to travel," she used to tell him while straightening a blanket. "The least we can do is make them feel happy they chose this place." At the time, he thought she was talking about clean rooms. Years later, after building his own hotel business, he finally understood she had been talking about respect. That afternoon, Colin asked his assistant to bring him the guest feedback reports from La Vella over the past year. He wasn't interested in housekeeping scores or inspection results. He wanted to know what guests actually remembered after checking out. For nearly an hour, he read through hundreds of comments. Very few people mentioned polished mirrors, neatly folded towels, or spotless bathrooms. Instead, they wrote about how comfortable the room felt after a long flight, how peaceful it was to return after a day of meetings, or how they slept better than expected. Colin closed the final report and leaned back in his chair. The reports confirmed something he had believed for years but had never heard expressed so simply. Great service wasn't about making guests notice how much work had been done. It was about removing every distraction that kept them from enjoying their stay. That was exactly what Nala had been trying to explain inside the executive suite. She hadn't been cleaning for an inspection. She had been preparing an experience. Colin smiled faintly as another memory of his mother came back to him. She had never talked about customer satisfaction scores or luxury standards. She simply wanted every guest to feel that the money they spent had been well worth it. Somehow, without ever meeting her, Nala had arrived at the very same conclusion. The following morning, Colin asked his assistant to invite Monique to his office before the management meeting began. When she arrived, he placed Nala's personnel file on the desk between them. There wasn't much inside, because Nala still worked through the staffing agency. Most of the documents were basic employment records and attendance reports. Colin closed the folder and looked at Monique. "Tell me about her," Monique answered without hesitation. "She arrives before everyone else, finishes every assignment, and never argues when she's asked to redo a room." "What happens when she makes a mistake?" Colin asked. "The same thing that happens to everyone else," Monique replied. "The difference is I never have to correct her twice." Colin nodded. "Has she ever been late?" "Not once." "Ever missed a shift without a good reason?" "No." Colin rested a hand on the folder. "Then why is she still temporary?" Monique gave the only answer she could. "Because we haven't had a permanent opening. If we did, she would have been my first recommendation." Colin looked at her for a moment before asking one last question. "If I approved a position today, would you still recommend her?" Monique smiled. "I'd recommend her before you finish signing the paperwork." After Monique left, Colin remained seated, looking through the office window toward the hotel courtyard below. Promoting Nala immediately would have been the easiest decision. It also would have been unfair. He had built every one of his companies around the same principle. Opportunities should never be handed to someone because of sympathy. They should be earned through ability. If he offered Nala a permanent position simply because her story reminded him of his mother, every employee who had spent years proving themselves would have reason to question that decision. He wasn't willing to do that. Instead, he reached for the phone. "Schedule a meeting with Monique this afternoon," he told his assistant. "I want us to design a 1-month evaluation. No special treatment. No easier standards. I want the exact test we'd give someone we're considering for a leadership track." He paused before adding one more instruction. "If she passes, she'll know she earned it. If she doesn't, nothing changes. Either way, the decision has to be based on her work, not my memories." That afternoon, Colin and Monique spent more than an hour discussing how the evaluation should work. Colin rejected the first proposal almost immediately. "This only measures speed," he said after reading the outline. "She already does this every day." Monique nodded and pulled the paper back. "Then what do you want to measure?" Colin stood up and walked toward the window. "Judgment." He turned back toward her. Anyone can follow a checklist. I want to know how she responds when the checklist isn't enough. He picked up a blank sheet of paper and drew 3 short lines across the page. Standard rooms test discipline. Can someone follow the process every single time? Executive suites test attention. Can they notice the details most people overlook? The presidential suite is different. He paused before finishing his thought. That room tests judgment. There won't always be a rule for every situation. I want to know whether she can make the right decision when no one tells her what to do. Monique nodded in agreement. Together, they redesigned the evaluation. During the first week, Nala would continue cleaning standard guest rooms. The second week would move her to executive suites. The third week would include special requests from VIP guests and last-minute room changes. The final week would place her in the presidential suite, where every detail would be reviewed before a guest arrived. Every room would be inspected. Every comment would be documented. No one would tell Nala she was being tested. The following morning, Monique stopped beside Nala's cart before the shift began. "I've got something different for you this month." Nala looked up from the supply cabinet. "What's changing?" Monique handed her a new assignment sheet. "You'll be rotating through different room categories instead of staying on one floor." Nala glanced over the schedule. Standard rooms during the first week. Executive suites after that. The presidential suite at the end of the month. She looked back at Monique. "Is someone going on vacation?" Monique smiled. "Let's just say I want to see how you handle different situations." Nala folded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket. "All right." She didn't ask any more questions. New assignment or old assignment, her routine never changed. She picked up her cart and headed toward the first room of the day. From his office, Colin watched the housekeeping reports arrive at the end of each day. He never asked whether Nala finished first or cleaned the most rooms. Instead, he read the inspection notes left by supervisors. One report mentioned that she noticed a loose curtain hook before the next guest checked in. Another noted that she requested maintenance after hearing an unusual sound from an air conditioning unit instead of ignoring it. A third mentioned that she replaced a flower arrangement because several petals had begun to wilt, even though no one had instructed her to do so. None of those actions appeared on Lavella's housekeeping checklist. Colin closed the report with a quiet smile. Without realizing it, Nala had already begun taking ownership of the hotel as though it were her own. The real evaluation had only just begun. As the weeks passed, the assignments became noticeably more demanding. Standard rooms were replaced by executive suites. Executive suites were followed by rooms reserved for returning VIP guests whose preferences were recorded long before they arrived. Although Nala didn't know she was being evaluated, she could tell Monique was watching her work more closely than usual. Almost every afternoon, another inspection sheet appeared on her cart with handwritten notes instead of simple check marks. Some reminded her to improve efficiency. Others pointed out details she had overlooked. Nala never argued with a single comment. She read every note after work, tucked it into the same notebook she had been carrying for years, and treated it the same way she had treated Monique's first correction on her very first day. Something to improve before tomorrow. The work became harder, but so did her determination. If Lavella expected more from her, she intended to become the kind of employee who could meet that expectation. Early Monday morning, Monique walked into the housekeeping office carrying only one assignment sheet. She stopped beside Nala before anyone else received their rooms. "Today's yours." Nala looked down at the room number and recognized it immediately. It was the presidential suite. She had cleaned executive suites many times, but this room was different. It was reserved for the hotel's most important guests and rarely became available. "Any special instructions?" Nala asked. Monique shook her head. "The same instructions I always give you," Nala smiled. "Clean it for the guest, not for the inspection." Monique returned the smile. "Exactly." Nala pushed her cart toward the private elevator that served the upper floors. The presidential suite was nearly 3 times larger than the rooms she usually cleaned. Every surface reflected natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Fresh flowers had already been delivered. A welcome basket sat on the dining table waiting to be arranged after housekeeping finished. Nala didn't reach for her cleaning supplies right away. She slowly walked through the suite from one room to another, stopping wherever she thought a guest might naturally pause. She stood beside the entrance, imagining the first impression after a long flight. She sat briefly on the sofa, looking toward the windows to see what would catch a guest's attention first. She walked into the bedroom, checking the view from the bed instead of the doorway. At the writing desk, she pulled out the chair, sat down for a moment, and rested her hands where a laptop would probably be placed. Only after seeing the suite from those different perspectives did she pick up her cleaning cloth. Just as she always did, she wasn't preparing a room for inspection. She was preparing it for the person who would soon call it home, even if only for a single night. Nala had just finished making the bed when her radio crackled to life. "Housekeeping. This is the front desk. We have an early arrival for the presidential suite. The guest will be here in 45 minutes. She looked around the room. Under normal circumstances, she still had nearly 2 hours before anyone checked in. There was enough time to inspect everything twice. That was no longer the case. She didn't rush. Instead, she stopped for a few seconds and changed the order of her work. The areas every guest would notice first came before everything else. The bedroom, bathroom, and entryway were completed first. She called engineering to replace a loose door stopper instead of trying to force it back into place herself. She asked room service to delay delivering the welcome basket until she finished polishing the dining table. Every minute mattered, but she refused to leave a problem for the next apartment simply because time was running short. By the time the suite was ready for inspection, there were still a few minutes left before the guest arrived. Monique entered the suite carrying her inspection checklist. She walked through every room without speaking, opening drawers, checking corners, examining mirrors, and testing the bathroom fixtures. When she reached the living room, she noticed the fresh flowers had been moved from the center of the coffee table to a side console near the windows. "Why did you move these?" she asked. Nala looked toward the arrangement. "The guest information says he's meeting 2 people here this afternoon. If the flowers stay in the middle of the table, they'll block eye contact while they're talking." Monique made a note before continuing. A few moments later, she noticed 2 bottles of complimentary water chilling inside a small ice bucket instead of sitting at room temperature beside the coffee machine. "That wasn't on the setup guide either," Nala smiled politely. "The reservation says the guest is arriving straight from the airport. Cold water is probably the first thing they'll want before they even unpack." Monique nodded and continued toward the writing desk. "You also moved the chair." "I did. Why?" "If they sit down to answer emails, the first thing they'll see is the window instead of a blank wall. Most people think more clearly when the room feels open." Monique wrote another note before closing the folder. She slowly looked around the suite one final time. Every required task had been completed exactly as the standards required. The differences were all in the small decisions no checklist could predict. She lowered the clipboard and looked back at Nala. "You know," she said with a faint smile, "I haven't asked you to redo a room in quite a while." Nala laughed softly. "That's because you taught me to inspect it before you do." Monique returned the smile and gave a small nod. "Keep doing that," Nala thanked her, collected her cart, and quietly headed toward her next assignment, never realizing every one of those small decisions had already become part of the report waiting on Colin's desk. That afternoon, Colin sat alone in his office, reviewing the reports from the month-long evaluation. He paid little attention to the final scores. Instead, he focused on the notes written by Monique and the supervisors who had inspected Nala's work each day. Again and again, the comments described someone who noticed small problems before they became guest complaints, worked naturally with other departments, and made thoughtful decisions without waiting for instructions. None of those qualities could be measured by a checklist alone. Colin closed the folder and rested it on his desk. A month earlier, he had wanted proof that his first impression hadn't been a coincidence. Now he had it. Nala hadn't passed because she cleaned rooms better than everyone else. She had passed because she consistently thought about the guest before thinking about the task. That was the kind of judgment he had been looking for from the very beginning. Near the end of the shift, Monique found Nala organizing her housekeeping cart before heading home. "Colin would like to see you before you leave." Nala looked up in surprise. "Did I miss something?" Monique smiled. "Why don't you ask him?" A few minutes later, Nala stood outside the CO's office and knocked gently on the open door. "Come in," Colin said. He stood from behind his desk and motioned toward the chair across from him. "Please, have a seat." Nala sat down, unsure why she had been called in. Colin placed a folder on the desk between them. "For the past month, you've been part of an evaluation." Nala looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't know I was being evaluated." "That was intentional," Colin replied. "I wanted to see your normal work, not your best performance because someone was watching." He opened the folder and turned it toward her. Inside were inspection reports from every stage of the evaluation. each page marked with comments from supervisors. Nala slowly flipped through them. She remembered nearly every room they described. Some contained compliments. Others pointed out details she could have handled better. Colin waited until she reached the last page before speaking again. "You passed every stage." He slid another document across the desk. "I'd like to offer you a permanent position at Lavella." Nala lowered her eyes to the contract. The words full-time housekeeping attendant appeared near the top of the page. She rested her fingertips on the title for a brief moment, almost as if making sure it was real. Below them were benefits she had never received before: paid vacation, health insurance, retirement contributions, and a guaranteed weekly schedule. She read the first page again, almost afraid she had misunderstood it. Colin didn't interrupt. He simply gave her time. After a long moment, Nala looked up. "Does this mean I won't have to wait outside the staffing agency anymore?" Colin smiled. "No more wondering whether your name will be called. As long as you keep doing the work you've been doing, you'll always have a place here." Nala looked back at the contract. For 6 years, every workday had depended on someone choosing her for a single shift. Now, for the first time since becoming a mother, she could plan next week without wondering whether there would be a paycheck. She swallowed gently before meeting Colin's eyes again. "Thank you." Her voice was calm, but the relief behind those 2 words said everything else. Nala looked down at the contract one more time before lifting her eyes again. "I'd love to stay." Colin extended his hand across the desk. "Then welcome to Lavella." Nala shook his hand with a smile she couldn't hide. It wasn't just another job. For the first time in 6 years, she no longer had to wake up wondering whether there would be work waiting for her that day. As she left the office, Monique was waiting in the hallway. She didn't ask what had happened. She had already guessed. Nala held up the folder with both hands, unable to stop smiling. Monique smiled back. "Congratulations. You earned it." Nala nodded. "Thank you for every time you made me do a room over." Monique laughed. "I was wondering if you'd ever forgive me for that. Now I'm glad you never let me settle." The 2 women walked toward the employee exit together. Outside, the evening air was as cold as ever, but for the first time in years, Nala walked home carrying certainty instead of hope. 4 years passed faster than Nala ever imagined. She no longer waited outside a staffing agency before sunrise, but she still woke up before her alarm almost every morning. Old habits stayed with her. The difference was that she now walked through the employee entrance at Lavella wearing a manager's name badge instead of a temporary visitor's pass. As housekeeping manager, she no longer spent every shift cleaning rooms herself. Most of her day was filled with training new attendants, checking quality standards, and helping her team solve problems before guests ever noticed them. Whenever a new employee apologized for making a mistake, Nala simply smiled and said, "Good, that means today is the day you'll stop making it." It was almost the same thing Monique had taught her years before. Colin had never forgotten where Nala came from. After watching her grow into one of the strongest managers in the company, he began looking at the staffing system differently. Every week, hundreds of people stood outside agencies across northern New Jersey hoping someone would call their name. Many of them were hardworking. Many simply needed someone willing to teach them. Colin met with several business owners who regularly struggled to hire dependable employees. Instead of asking agencies to send whoever happened to be available, Lavella partnered with them to create a training program. Applicants would spend several weeks learning housekeeping, customer service, workplace communication, and professional standards before ever reporting to a hotel. Those who completed the program successfully would be recommended directly to hotels, office buildings, and other businesses that needed reliable employees. Colin made one condition clear from the beginning. Nobody gets hired because they have a difficult story. They get hired because they prove they can do the job. On the morning the first training class opened, Nala stood at the front of the room looking at 20 nervous faces. Some reminded her of herself 6 years earlier. Others looked even more uncertain. She smiled before introducing herself. "My name is Nala Miller. A few years ago, I was standing outside a staffing agency every morning hoping somebody would give me one day's work. Today I'm here because someone taught me that doing the smallest things well eventually opens bigger doors." She didn't tell them success would come quickly. She didn't promise life would become easy. Instead, she picked up a neatly folded towel from the demonstration table. "We're not starting with a towel," she said, lifting it for everyone to see. "We're starting with the person who's going to use it. If you understand that, everything else becomes easier to learn." Several months after the training program began, Monique announced she was retiring. She had spent more than 20 years at La Vela and believed it was finally time to slow down. Before leaving, she asked Nala to walk with her through the hotel one last time. They followed the same hallways where Nala had once pushed a housekeeping cart as a temporary worker who didn't know how to make a bed properly. Monique stopped outside one of the executive suites and smiled. "Do you remember your first inspection?" Nala laughed. "You made me strip the entire bed because you found dust on the headboard. You were upset. I was. You came back the next day anyway." Nala looked down the hallway before answering. "Because I needed the job." Monique shook her head gently. "No, a lot of people need jobs. You came back because you wanted to become better." Before walking away, Monique unclipped the master inspection key from her uniform and placed it in Nala's hand. "It's yours now." Nala looked at the key for a long moment before quietly saying, "I hope I can do this half as well as you did." Monique smiled. "You'll do it differently. That's even better." The first group of trainees eventually became full-time employees at hotels, office buildings, and conference centers across the state. Some remained at La Vela, while others accepted positions with companies that partnered with Collins' program. Whenever a new housekeeper joined Nala's department, she never began by handing them a checklist. Instead, she walked them into an empty guest room and asked a simple question. "Imagine you've been traveling all day. What's the first thing you'd hope to feel when you open this door?" The answers were different every time. Comfortable, safe, relaxed, welcome. Only after hearing their answers did Nala begin teaching them how to clean the room. "Everything we do should help create that feeling," she would say. "If you only clean for the inspection, you'll miss the person who's actually staying here." One afternoon, Nala finished her last meeting and walked through the employee entrance carrying a small paper bag from the hotel cafe. Across the parking lot, a tall teenager leaned against a bicycle, scrolling through his phone while he waited. The moment he noticed her, he smiled and waved. Anton was 11 now, nearly as tall as his mother and still carrying the same easygoing smile he had as a child. "You're late," he teased as she walked over. 5 whole minutes, Nala laughed. "My manager kept me." Anton raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure you were the manager. Then I guess I should talk to myself about that." He grinned as they started walking toward the park a few blocks away, talking about school, basketball practice, and the science fair he had signed up for. 4 years earlier, those conversations usually happened across a small kitchen table after dark. Now they happened while the sun was still high enough to warm the sidewalks. On their way home from the park, Anton slowed down in front of a familiar bakery. Nala followed his eyes and smiled the moment she recognized it. Years earlier, they had stopped outside the same window, breathing in the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls before quietly walking away because there were more important things to pay for. Anton laughed. "I still remember that day! So do I!" Nala replied. "I kept pretending I wasn't hungry because I knew we couldn't spend the money." Nala looked at him with a gentle smile. "I know." She reached for the door. "Come on!" A few minutes later, they sat beside the window with a box of warm cinnamon rolls between them. Anton picked one up, took a bite, and laughed. These really were worth waiting for. Nala smiled as she watched him finish the first one before reaching for another. Years ago, she had promised herself that one day she wouldn't have to tell her son, "Maybe next time." She hadn't realized how much that small promise had stayed with her until the day she was finally able to keep it. After leaving the bakery, they wandered back through the park with nowhere they needed to be. Anton borrowed a basketball from a recreation center and challenged his mother to a shooting contest. Nala missed far more shots than she made, giving Anton plenty of reasons to laugh. They shared popcorn beside the lake, watched children chase pigeons across the grass, and rented a small paddle boat before the afternoon slipped into evening. None of it was expensive. None of it would ever appear in a family photo album as a once-in-a-lifetime vacation. Yet to Nala, those ordinary hours felt more valuable than anything money could buy because she no longer spent every minute calculating what had to be sacrificed next. As the sun dipped lower, Anton leaned back on the bench and looked at his mother. "Can we do this again next weekend?" Nala didn't have to think about bus schedules, overtime shifts, or whether there would be enough money left after paying the bills. She simply smiled. Absolutely. Early Monday morning, before the city had fully awakened, the first bus rolled through the quiet streets of Paterson once again. Harris sat behind the wheel, greeting the familiar faces climbing aboard at each stop. As the bus reached Nala's old stop, he glanced toward the sidewalk out of habit. It had been years since she last stood there waiting with her lunch bag, yet every now and then he still caught himself looking. The light turned green, and the bus continued down the road. Across town, Nala poured herself a cup of coffee before heading to Lavella, where a new group of trainees would be waiting for her. On the kitchen table sat Anton's school backpack, ready for another day. Beside it rested the faded drawing of a city bus beneath a sky full of stars, now framed instead of folded inside a wallet. Nala picked it up for a moment, smiled, then placed it back where it belonged before leaving for work. She no longer needed the first bus to build a better future, but every better day in her life had begun with one decision most people would never notice: catching the first bus before sunrise.